Jinhua, thank you. And really kudos to the M3S team, as you saw with that introductory presentation. This is a remarkably ambitious program. And in the first year, the progress has been really substantial, and I think you'll see that today. To set the stage, we thought it would be appropriate to give some opening remarks on some observations on national AI policy, just to get some grounding here. So let me kick right off with an understanding of what there is broad agreement on. There's definitely broad agreement that there are serious risks in the application of AI. We invest a lot of time thinking about these kind of longer term and catastrophic risks, and we're really in the need to develop a bunch of new tools to assess, monitor, and mitigate the risks associated with AI. There are certain applications which can create substantial risk and harm, and I think there's real agreement that national policies will have to address these. Where there's disagreement is whether and how there is substantial existential risk here and how to think that through. So to frame this set of really quite challenging topics to think about from a national policy level, we wanted to give you the further framework. Thinking about two different sets of criteria. First, embodiment. Embodiment is really understanding the extent to which AI can physically be connected and interact with the real world. This was not something we were thinking about, frankly, kind of 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago, but it's quite substantial today. And if you can think about how this can occur even when the original purpose was not there, but the ability exists. The second is thinking through autonomy. So the idea that AI can think and can plan independently without direct input, without guidance from a human, looking at things like tree of thought, agent-based approaches, meta-prompting. The combination of these two things, as we'll talk through, increases substantially the risk that's at play here. So kind of putting these two together, the embodiments on the y-axis, the autonomy on the x-axis, the least risky is on the bottom left, where we think about a few years ago where we could just use these tools and have them on a self-contained user basis. Where it gets more interesting and more complicated is where the level of actual embodiment is more substantial. So here we're thinking about self-driving cars, Industry 4.0. We're going to talk a lot today about the impact of AI being applied in robotics. The risk obviously increases. Now, if instead you have low levels of embodiment, but the increasing autonomy, the ability to do goal-oriented planning, self-learning, when that gets put to work, and ChatGPT for many of us was a real example of seeing this in process, the risk goes up. It's a lot more substantial than we would have seen 2, 3 years ago. Now, where it gets particularly interesting and where there's a bit more of a red zone of risk is where you get that combination, often through APIs and often not with the original intent, where you can leverage these LLMs and put them to work. And this is things like ChatGPT for robotics. And again, with APIs that can write emails, can do social media posts. That kind of red zone risk of where you have high levels of autonomy and high levels of embodiment, that is where it gets more challenging. And this is what regulators are really struggling with. Now, as we think about how to tackle from a national policy standpoint AI, we thought it would be helpful to give some sort of a simple framework here. I'll be the first to say that it's pretty rare, uncommon, if not non-existent, that many countries, any countries, have anything at the top of the pyramid. The idea that anyone can have an overarching vision and strategy, that's still getting felt out. I'd say Singapore is probably one of the few countries that is on the right path to defining that, but this will be a journey. It's not easy to get that right. A lot of focus here in the region, and we'll hear this through the panel discussion, is on that first row. Thinking about stimulating innovation and adoption, both on the supply side and the demand side. And we'll talk about that in a second. Particularly here in Southeast Asia, that has been a real focus, just how to get more actual adoption and practical impact. If we think about that third row, and this gets covered a lot by some of the M3S efforts, the idea of human and technical capacity, talent, skills, employment, data, compute, and infrastructure, a lot of national policy is on this, particularly on the right. Increasingly for more nations, and Singapore, I think, is really at the forefront here on the left about thinking through some of the human implications, some of the talent and skill implications required. It's that next row where the EU is trying to do more, where I think the US will want to do more, but from a legislative standpoint will be more constrained. But this idea of building trust and safe use of AI through different measures will be critically important. The last part is complicated. I'm going to ask Simon Chesterman to talk more about this later. But whether it's OECD or the efforts by the United Nations, this thought of international collaboration is something that is still in its early infancy. So if I kind of pull all that together and think about what a world map of national AI policy looks like, it's quite a varied picture. We all know that in the United States, the ability to enact legislation through Congress, particularly in a fractured political environment like we have today in an election year, quite challenging. So what I think we're going to be seeing in the US is more industry by industry approaches. So in pharmaceuticals that will be regulated by one agency, the FDA will look at it from a food standpoint. So industry by industry will probably be the approach in the US. You could have the potential for executive orders top down, but we'll have to see how that plays out with this election. Europe is kind of interesting. Europe is in a stage where, in some ways, they were on the front foot and ahead. They've been kind of negotiating the EU AI Act, which got passed in late 23 and early 24, adopted in May of this year. They've been at this for a while, and it's interesting because they started this journey in 2021. What you'll see is a lot of the EU AI Act is really about traditional AI, and it's really just been a bit more of an addendum over the course of the last 12 months that they've started to approach Gen AI. The level of sophistication of this legislation is still quite at the early stage. And in ASEAN, the Guide to AI Governance and Ethics, which got launched in February 2024 of this year, it's a fully voluntary framework, and it's really more focused on business that want to consume and build apps with AI, rather than on the foundation model developers themselves, such as OpenAI. So I think kind of a practical approach, which we'll talk about in the panel discussion shortly. And I'll save the discussion on the right, on the global approaches, to Simon to share later. So in summary, when we think about national AI policy, thinking about that towards use cases, I think this is one thing that we can agree to, these 6 sets of consistent areas which need to be addressed. Now, how they'll get addressed, how that will vary by geography, that's a rich part of this discussion. But I think the one thing we can agree on is these different sets of areas are going to be quite critical to address.